Yes, sedite. I'm the Roman Orthodox, but you can call me Roman or Magister Romanus. Either way, it's up to you. And the topic for today is how does traditionalist Catholicism work? In other words, how does it mechanically, legally, canonically, all of those things work in real life? Um, I say this as someone who was a traditionalist Catholic for 16 years, and now I'm an Eastern Orthodox convert. So I taught I taught in a traditionalist Catholic school. I went to a traditional Latin Mass only parish for most of that time as a traditionalist Catholic, although I started out a normal Novus Ordo Catholic parish and then eventually switched over to a Novus Ordo and traditional Latin Mass parish, and then went further into a Fraternity of St. Peter parish, occasionally attending other groups like the Institute of Christ the King or the Society of St. Pius X. And so I have quite a bit of experience with other traditionalist groups and with, meeting people at different organizations, different meetings, different conventions and so forth. And so I have a little bit of perspective on how traditionalism actually works in real life. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing that we have to talk about as far as traditionalist Catholicism goes is that traditionalists are not all united in terms of communion. So not all traditionalist Catholics will commune with one another or at each other's churches. So that's sort of a background here. If you imagine traditionalist Catholicism as like a neighborhood with 3 houses on it, the first house would be the what I would call like the regular or canonical traditionalists. Another thing that they're often called is indult traditionalists, especially by SSPXers or by Sedevacantists and that sort of group. So you have the regular or the canonical traditionalists, and this group is sort of the closest to being normal Catholics. So this group can have a few different sort of formats. One is that it might be a normal parish under the local bishop, and that local parish might be served by a priest under the local bishop, a diocesan priest, who is simply serving the traditional Latin Mass at this parish or this chapel. So this is becoming an increasingly rare group of traditionalists, especially after Traditionis Custodes, that recent decree from Pope Francis, because that decree made it very difficult for such communities to continue to exist, especially in parish churches. So a lot of them are being moved out into chapels or being switched over to another format. So the second way that is most common is that you will have a parish or a chapel or an oratory. There's a little bit of distinction between those in terms of, what their standing is in the church, but I'm not going to get into that right now. But basically a church that is under the local bishop, but it's being served by one or more traditionalist Catholic priestly societies. So as far as the lay people that go to the parish or the chapel or the oratory go, they're just, ordinary Catholics under the local bishop, but they happen to go to a church that's served by a traditionalist Catholic priestly fraternity or order, usually fraternity. So those groups might be the Institute of Christ the King, the Fraternity of St. Peter, the Priestly Fraternity of St. Peter, or there are some, I believe, that are under the Oratorians, although usually the Oratorians are are religious houses that happen to serve both the traditional Latin Mass and the Novus Ordo. So, that's sort of a different group altogether, or a different type of Catholic altogether, in my opinion. So generally speaking, you'll have a parish that's served by one of the two, essentially the Institute of Christ the King or the Fraternity of St. Peter. There are a few other small ones like the Institut de Bon Pasteur and overseas. And some other very small communities, although those are also becoming rare because those small communities are increasingly being suppressed by the Holy See. So generally speaking, today you're talking about one of the two. Okay, so that's your regular or canonical traditionalists. Now, these groups are very interesting because the regular or canonical, or let's just call them indult. That'll work. We'll call them indult traditionalists. Tend to be a very sort of diverse group. So on the one hand, you may have sort of ordinary Joe Catholics who just happen to find themselves going to this parish because it's the nearest one, or they like the priest, or they kind of like the traditional Latin Mass, but they don't really identify as a traditionalist. And they may just go to that parish just as a matter of course. And for them, their practice of Catholicism won't be all that much different from the normal Novus Ordo Catholic, although it may change over time under the influence of their parish. So then again, you might have traditionalists there who are, ethically and who very much, are convinced by the need for the traditional Latin Mass, and they go to this parish, and they may be convinced that you also need to be canonically regular. So you need to be, in communion with your local bishop, and you need to follow a canonically regular group. They may have this sort of opinion, and in that sense, they're going to be ordinary Catholics, but they're just going to happen to go to this local parish, but their practice may be a little more on the traditionalist end, right? So they may have some more distinctive practices in the Catholic faith. Another group there might be sort of people who would normally go to one of these other two groups that I'm going to describe, but there's not one around, so they, bite their lip and go ahead and go to the indult community, since it is the traditional Latin Mass. And here's probably a good time to talk about one ideology that gets bounced around a lot in traditionalist Catholic circles. So there is often this idea there is this theory in most traditionalist communities that goes something like this. Your conscience, that is your properly formed Catholic conscience, so formed by the Catholic faith, your conscience is ultimately the determiner of what you should do as far as attending the Mass, or attending liturgies, attending particular churches, going to particular priests. And many traditionalists would say that if you feel in your conscience that you cannot morally approach a normal Catholic priest, like a diocesan priest, for the sacraments, especially for to go to Mass there, if there tend to be grave sacramental abuses at Novus Ordo English Masses and so forth, then you have the right to go anywhere that is Catholic, even if it's canonically irregular. And this also goes into the idea that if your local authority, like if your bishop is greatly opposed to traditionalist practices, then you have the authority to sort of go around him. And so you have this centrality of the Catholic conscience that's like part of the core ideology of traditionalism. Now, many traditionalists who go to normal or to indult parishes hold to this ideology. It's more applicable to the next group that we're going to talk about, but many of them believe this. And so many of them will not go to a Novus Ordo parish, even if they are normal, regular Catholics that go to a regular parish. They will not go to the Novus Ordo because they believe it's morally wrong for them to do so. And you have the centrality of conscience. The way that conscience works in traditionalist communities as part of the ideology is to sort of insulate those communities from being controlled by the larger Roman Catholic Church institution, right? So a lot of times individual families, individual communities have widely varying practices, some more extreme and some less extreme, some with more conservative dress codes, some with less conservative dress codes, some that identify more as exclusively traditionalists, some that identify themselves as just normal Catholics who happen to prefer the Latin Mass. All of these, points along the spectrum exist because of the centrality of conscience in the ideology of traditionalism. Okay, so that gets us to group number 2. I'm going to call these the irregular traditionalists, or the SSPXers, because the main group in the irregular group are the SSPX. These are traditionalist Catholics who are technically in communion with the Catholic Church, with the Pope. They commemorate the local bishops. They are considered Catholics, full stop. And they seem to have valid orders and valid, sacraments and all of those sorts of things. But, and although there are some exceptions to that, so we'll come back to this, but they are led by communities that are not recognized by the Vatican as being established canonically, as being legally established under the Church. The biggest group, of course, is the Society of St. Pius X. And I want to talk in a little bit more depth about the Society of St. Pius X, because in my opinion, this is sort of emblematic of part of the problem with traditionalism. So in the Society of St. Pius X, you have a fraternity, a priestly fraternity, very similar to the Fraternity of St. Peter. So this is a group of priests who are not under a bishop, but who have joined together as like a religious order, kind of, except without vows of poverty. So they are joined together as a group, kind of like a religious order, and they're brought in to take care of particular parishes. Now, what happened with the Society of St. Pius X is they started out just as such a priestly fraternity, but eventually they were deemed canonically irregular because they opposed the new Mass and they refused to offer it. So way back when, I believe it was way back when, they were sort of recognized as no longer canonically regular. Now they use the conscience sort of clause in canon law, basically to say that they can't morally approach the local bishop, they can't morally follow the Pope, and so because of that, they have the right to continue to exist and to exercise supplied jurisdiction. Now, I would say that probably more than half of the traditionalists who go to indult masses are perfectly willing to go to SSPX masses. And because they agree with this central idea, like whether or not they, ultimately choose to go to an SSPX church is a whole different question. But I'd say a lot of traditionalists agree with this idea that in some way the Holy See's authority is impeded because because of its opposition to the traditional Latin Mass, which has only grown more in these most recent days post Traditionis Custodes. So, their argument becomes a little bit easier to make to other traditionalists. So the SSPX, the Society of St. Pius X, operates in under this idea that they have supplied jurisdiction because, from canon law, supplied jurisdiction because they believe they morally, in good conscience, cannot follow the directives of the local bishop, of the pope, etc. Now, here's what that meant. Obviously, when you have a priestly fraternity, if you're going to get more priests, you need willing bishops to ordain those priests. And of course, most bishops, most ordinary bishops, are not willing to ordain priests for a canonically irregular society. In fact, it would be illegal for them to do so under canon law. So using that supplied jurisdiction model, the founder of the Society of St. Pius X, Archbishop Lefebvre, consecrated 3 bishops. And I like to call these bishops the bishops of nowhere, because they are not bishops of any particular see. They are not bishops for any particular place. They aren't even the bishops of the Society of St. Pius X. They are so-called sacramental bishops who have no place and no authority and no jurisdiction, etc., etc. Now, those 3 bishops serve as members of the Society of St. Pius X, and every once in a while, one of them is elected as the superior of the Society of St. Pius X, but they're not the bishops of the SSPX, which is really weird. That's why, the SSPX, they're kind of like high church Presbyterians, right? Because their whole order is governed by the elected head of this priestly group, like a session. And the bishops just kind of do what the elected head of the SSPX directs them to do. Unless, of course, they break away, like Bishop Williamson, and form the SSPX in Resistance, which is another sort of out there group that claims to be the real SSPX. But anyway, that's the idea behind the SSPX. Now, there are other groups, other orders, other I think there are some Benedictines, there are some Dominicans, there are even some Eastern Rite priests that all derive their orders from the SSPX bishops and rely on the SSPX for sort of spiritual guidance and authority. The one I think about as an Eastern Orthodox the most is the Society of St. Josaphat, which is a group of, I believe they're Ukrainian, a group of Ukrainian priests that are under the SSPX, and they serve a form of the Eastern Rite with all those Latinizations left in that had been taken out, and I believe serving in Slavonic as well. So, interesting group that. But there are, religious houses and orders and so forth that all sort of tag along with the SSPX. So if you think of the SSPX as sort of an archdiocese for the irregular traditionalists, you're not too far off. It kind of operates that way, except it's run by the priests instead of the bishops. There you go. Very traditional. Okay, so what about the third house? The third house on our street of traditionalism, on Lefebvre Street in the TLM neighborhood, are, I'm going to call them the Sedevacantists, however, or the Sedes. The Sedevacantists are not all Sedevacantists. You'd have some who are so-called Sede-privationists, and you have some that are conclavists. So I'll explain those terms. Sedevacantists believe that because the Pope has fallen into heresy, not the current Pope, but there are Sedevacantists that hold that, the popes were fine until the current Pope. But there are other but most Sedevacantists think it was John the 23rd. Some think it was Pius the 12th. It sort of depends. But these are groups that think that because of the heresy in the Vatican, that the throne of the Pope is empty. it's vacant. And there are different groups, that disagree as to which pope it was that fell away. So you do have some division there. And then you have Sedeprivationists, who think that it's not vacant, but that the person who's occupying it is deprived. Sedeprivationists, deprived of his authority because he's a heretic. And I'm trying to think if there are conclavists are groups of Sedevacantists or Sedeprivationists that have got together and elected a new pope. It's a very small group of those, and I'm not sure how many claimants to the papal throne there are anymore. Of course, the most famous on the internet was Pope Michael I over in Kansas. There were a tiny number of people that followed him, and there have been other claimants. I think there was what was he? Pope Pius XIII, I believe it was. And I'm going to leave out of the conclavist groups, these sort of true wackos like the Palmarians and the sort of go-it-aloners who, believe that the priestless traditionalists, to use a term from the old believers, who think that, there are no valid orders anymore because of the apostasy. So just, sort of, I'll leave those out of the neighborhood. Those are the people who wander into the neighborhood and out of it and in and out. And you never know where they're really going. But anyway, we'll stick to the three main houses on the street. Now, Sedevacantists also have a variety of formats. So like the sort of indult traditionalists and the SSPXers, many of them are in priestly societies. I think of the Society of St. Pius V as an example, or in religious orders like the CMRI. Others are organized more like sort of local parishes, but with a bishop. Others are organized almost like dioceses. And so they come in a variety of formats. And of course, they get to do whatever they want to because, they don't think there's a pope to tell them what to do. So they have a slightly different perspective on things than the SSPXers or the indult traditionalists. Now, looking at all the groups, rather than looking at them individually, some things that you can see about them, in common. One is that is the centrality of the priest in these organizations. So in all three groups, you have priestly societies that are the main driver of the traditionalist communities, not bishop-led organizations or not dioceses. There is one, I left them out. I forgot to mention them. There is one indult community that is under a bishop that has ordinary canonical authority. That's the Apostolic Administration in Campos, Brazil. That is a tiny group of traditionalists. Well, it's not tiny in and of itself, but it's a tiny percentage of traditionalists. And it's worth mentioning that it's not a diocese, it's an apostolic administration. So it shares borders with a local diocese, an overlapping jurisdiction, if you will, to use an Orthodox term. So that's an exception, but most traditionalist communities are led by groups of priests who happen to be served by bishops. The ones where you're most likely to have bishops that are actually in charge are over on the Sedevacantist side of things, because they have, bishops from various sources. So the as a result, these communities are governed more as a consensus of priests than as hierarchical organizations, which I think is really interesting, that despite being traditional, they don't live within the traditional apostolic order of the church. They sort of try to exist outside of it because they think the traditional apostolic order of the Catholic Church has been in some way corrupted, right? And so they're trying to escape from that by having all of these non-traditional structures. Another thing that you can say about all of these groups is that they tend to be homeschooling groups. So even on the adult side, although you do have sort of a spectrum there, right? But generally, traditionalists are homeschoolers. They may use various curricula. I see a lot of TAN publishing, although that has sort of tapered off with the change in ownership over at TAN Publishing. But yeah, they have their own publishing houses for homeschooling materials. That's fairly common. As is true, of course, of many Orthodox groups, you have a lot of homeschooling. They tend to be more conservative in dress, and some of them may be conservative in dress both in church and out of church. So you may have a little more leeway over in the adult communities as to what you wear when you're not at Mass on Sunday morning. But in most traditionalist groups, they tend to wear very conservative clothing. Of course, all of them, by and large, veil for Mass. Maybe a few diocesan adult communities veiling is not common, but it is certainly the norm in traditionalist communities. You also have various levels of recognition between the groups. So this is my experience. Adult traditionalists tend to be fairly sympathetic to the SSPXers, and they even may share the same ideology. They just don't also think that, it's wrong to be an adult traditionalist. So they may be perfectly willing to go to an SSPX Mass, SSPXers tend to say that adult communities are dangerous. They may be sort of ambivalent on whether or not you can go to them, but they tend to say no, right? That they're dangerous and it's a flirtation with the other side. And Sedevacantists, right, will say that the others are both wrong because they both commemorate a pope who is heretical. Some Sedevacantists may even say that about each other. So one Sedevacantist group may tell you not to go to another group of Sedevacantists or Sedeprivationists, although I have heard that Sedevacantists and Sedeprivationists sometimes will share communion and sometimes will attend each other's masses. So that's what I've heard. That's occasionally the case, but you can let me know in the comments if that's correct or not. There can be some complications, right, when you start combining groups or when you start dealing with the mechanics of, ordinary Catholic things, especially like marriage and confession are the most complicated things. So in the Catholic Church, in order for two people to get married, right, they are theoretically the ministers of the sacrament to each other. But to do it validly, according to the Catholic Church, they have to have it witnessed by a canonical Catholic priest. Okay? So if you're going to an adult community, that's no problem. As long as your local priest has the authority to witness marriages, then you're fine. He will have the authority to witness marriages, to administer Holy Confession, and so forth, right? That's no big deal. The SSPXers have a very odd delegated authority to perform marriages and to hear confessions. This was directly given to them by, I believe it was by Pope Francis, as part of the Year of Mercy. And I think it's been continued ever since then. It may have been discontinued at some point. I'm not entirely sure. I think it's still in effect. So they have this authority, but previous to that grant being given, they didn't have that canonical authority. And so they would have the couple sign a little document saying that they morally could not approach the local Catholic priest and therefore had to seek the sacrament from the SSPX priest. And then with confessions, it was the same concept, right? Supplied jurisdiction in cases of emergency. And Sedevacantists, since there's no pope, no normal ordinary jurisdiction of a bishop or of the pope, and so they perform marriages and they hear confessions. Now, when I say that this can get complicated going from one to the other, marriage is a good example. So you'll have a couple that, let's say they got married, let's say that they are Catholics, right? So they've been baptized and confirmed by a Catholic priest and Catholic bishop in some kind of good standing, or like by the SSPX or whatever. And they've gotten married in one of these Sedevacantist, Sedeprivationist communities. The Catholic Church, the big RCC, would tend to say that that's invalid. And as it did with SSPX marriages before the indult was given for them to perform marriages. So they would say that's invalid because it was in front of a non-canonical Catholic priest. Now, if they, however, had been baptized and confirmed by a Sedevacantist bishop and priest, assuming that the sacraments were valid, and assuming that these Sedevacantist, Sedeprivationist groups are not considered Catholic, then their marriage would be valid because they were just non-Catholics getting married. But what if one of them was Catholic? Well, then it would be invalid. You see the problem. Now, I have heard of this. Before the indult for the SSPX was given, I had heard of young traditionalist couples getting married in SSPX chapels, knowing that they would easily get an annulment if they switched over to a normal Catholic parish, because it would be found invalid. As long as they stuck in the traditionalist community, seen as valid. They switch over to the to a different area, different Catholic church, they could call it off, get married again in a different traditional Catholic church, like an indult community, and all's good, right? So I have heard of that happening. You can always trust the young people in any religion, even traditionalist Catholicism, to try to find loopholes around actually, following the rules. It's always the cradles that come up with exceptions. So anyway, so that was very common or I don't know that it was very common, but I heard of such a thing happening in traditionalist circles. But these sort of canonical questions about marriage and about confession persist amongst the various traditionalist communities. And because you tend to have a certain level of scrupulosity, I'm not judging the whole group, but I'm just saying there is scrupulosity in traditionalist circles. I've seen it. Not going to accuse any particular person of it, but it's out there. Certain scrupulous people would only go to indult communities because they were worried about the validity of confession or matrimony. But they might go to the SSPX or to the Sedevacantists for everything else. So you have a certain level of gray area in between the groups. As far as how these groups are organized, there is great variety. So indel communities tend to be normal parishes established under the local bishop, served by a priestly fraternity of some sort that's in good standing with the Pope. There is some diversity as far as whether that local parish is owned by the priestly fraternity, or is it owned legally by the local bishop. It kind of comes in both varieties. Amongst SSPXers, you may have some chapels that are owned by the SSPX. I think that's a very small number, but you'll also have local chapels that are owned by local people that just sort of get a contract with the SSPX to bring priests in to celebrate. And you may have other groups that are traditionalist organizations, like traditionalist lay organizations that have agreement that own the local chapel, that then those traditionalist organizations reach out to the SSPX and say, hey, send a priest here to celebrate Mass. And there is some distinction between those two. There have been some debate. There has been some debate, I believe, in Rome about whether you fulfill your Sunday obligation. If you go to an SSPX chapel, probably yes. If you go to one of these chapels owned by an independent lay organization that happens to have an SSPX priest, possibly not. You can see the legal niceties there. And then on the other hand, the Sedevacantists, they may be owned by a central organization that owns various chapels, or they may be owned by local community members. And both in the SSPX and in the Sedevacantist group, if you have the chapel owned by local parishioners, those chapels tend to have a lot more independence in their governance. You sort of have a situation where the local lay people can kind of tell the priest what to do, or tell the priest to get lost, and they try to find another priest, or maybe an independent priest or an independent bishop of some variety. So one of the things about traditionalism that is often missed is the level of local independence that traditionalists exercise. So even though the community is very tight-knit and it's hierarchical in the sense that you may have a local priest that, essentially sets the tempo for all the traditional practices that are common in that community, each community may be very fiercely independent from the other and have its own ideologies and its own practices. And that's what I'll say to sort of close up this video is that, don't take what I'm saying as being like absolutely true of all traditionalist communities, because they are so fiercely independent and so lay-led and or priest-led that they don't have, a sort of hierarchical structure that imposes some measure of uniformity even within jurisdictions, even within individual organizations. As an Eastern Orthodox convert from traditionalist Catholicism, all I can say is one of the reasons why I joined the Eastern Orthodox Church was to get out of this weird ecclesiology of traditionalism and into a church that truly respected the apostolic structure of the church. Bishop, priest, right? Layman. Bishop, priests, and deacons, and laymen. So, my goal in joining the Orthodox Church, or one of my goals in joining the Orthodox Church, was to join a church that properly followed the structure that was established by Christ through the apostles, rather than all of these weird, priest-led, lay-led, bishops of nowhere sort of movements in the church. So trying to get away from all of that, and also trying to avoid the scrupulosity that ultimately causes these sorts of weird structures. Fundamentally, I believe the Orthodox Church has has the proper structure for the church, even though it may seem chaotic at times. It follows the tradition, I believe, more faithfully than the traditionalist Catholic groups do. And with that, I'll say adiosas, valete. Hope you all have a very good evening. Kalispera.